Turning back to our coverage of Bolivia's elections, we are joined by Miguel Figueroa, the president of the Canadian Peace Congress. Hey, Miguel, thanks for joining us.
Oh, thank you, and good evening, everyone.
Now, can you talk to us a bit about the work your organization does and how it relates to Latin America?
Sure, certainly. The Canadian Peace Congress actually is one of the oldest peace organizations in the country, in Canada. It was founded in 1949. So actually, this year we're celebrating our 70th anniversary. Or last year we celebrated our 70th anniversary. Um, and as a peace organization, we are not just in favor of peace, but we think it's our responsibility to identify the source of the war danger in the world today. And we consider that to be US imperialism and its allies, including the role of the Canadian government itself. So we consider ourselves to be an anti-imperialist peace organization, which by definition means that we speak out not only about general issues relating to nuclear disarmament and so on, but also around issues of people's struggles for sovereignty, for democracy, for their independence, and for equality internationally, and the rule of international law. So obviously, what's happening in Latin America is, of course, a particular concern to us. The the regime change agenda of Washington with respect to Venezuela, the role of the big powers, including Canada, by the way, in the constitutional coups which have taken place. Well, obviously the overthrow of Aristide in Haiti, and then the removal of President Zelaya in Honduras in 2009, and of course the situation that has been unfolding in Bolivia. So we consider that to be part of our mandate. We stand for peace, but also for social justice, and we are an internationalist peace organization. So we feel a special kinship with the peoples of the Americas in general, and also particularly with the indigenous peoples of Latin America, because of course we have big struggles in Canada as well in defense of the rights of our own indigenous peoples in this territory.
What do you think are some of the ways in which hegemonic governments can actually help democracy return to some of these affected countries?
Well, I think they're the problem. It's not a question of whether they can help or not. They are part of the problem. But that it's important to point out that that doesn't necessarily reflect the views of the Canadian people. And one of the things which progressive organizations, peace organizations, anti-imperialist organizations in Canada are trying to do is to mobilize the trade unions, to mobilize mass organizations amongst students, amongst women, amongst the indigenous peoples themselves, to put pressure to, first of all, to expose the role that the Canadian government is playing as a handmaiden and as a collaborator with Washington, with U.S. imperialism, and to pressure the government to change its course. Of course, it's not easy. It's a big struggle, but that's what we're trying to do.
I mean, what is your organization's stance? I mean, it's obvious because you've spoken about it, but how do you activate against and also expose Canada's role in supporting the covert operations of the United States when it comes to toppling governments across different regions?
Well, of course, our main priority, first and foremost, is to expose the role that Canada in particular has been playing and why it has been playing the role that it has. Let's take the case of Bolivia, for instance. I think that most people in the Americas are well aware of the fact that Canada is an imperialist country in its own right, and particularly in the financial sector and in the sector of natural resources, and particularly in terms of mining. Canada is the largest has the largest mining industry in the world, and it has the most assets in the mining sector in the world. it's in the order of $270 billion that Canadian companies own and control. And interestingly, over two-thirds of that 270 billion is not in Canada. It's in other countries. There's some in the United States. There's some in Africa, a bit in Asia, but primarily it's in Latin America itself. In countries like Brazil, Argentina, Chile, Colombia, and they have been expanding their activities, and they've been engaging in anti-worker assaults on trade unions in these countries. They've been fouling the environment at the expense of the peoples in these communities. The peasants in these communities have been destroying farmland and so on, and they're doing it for profit. It's a straightforward circumstance. The problem is that the Canadian government, acting in league with these transnational corporations, these big monopolies, has been trying to facilitate this plunder. And so Canada's attitude, for instance, towards Venezuela and the role that it's been playing in the Lima Group is part and parcel of, it's not just an ideological question, it's not just a political question, it's an economic question. And so one of the things that we're trying to do is to expose the basis for this Canadian policy, which is something which serves the interests of big business, but it isn't in the interests of the majority of the Canadian people. So part of it is, of course, an educational role, but of course, we don't think it's just a question of education or just getting petitions. So we work with solidarity groups, in solidarity with Cuba, with Venezuela, with Latin American solidarity groups. As a matter of fact, just today in Toronto, we had a demonstration which was co-sponsored by the Peace Congress and the Latin American and Caribbean Solidarity Network. And it was about the elections that are taking place today in Bolivia. And so there was a lot of discussion there and actions that we plan to continue to take in solidarity with the struggles of the Bolivian people, not just for democracy in general, but for their democratic rights to determine their own future, to decide their own policies with respect to their natural resources, with respect to the environment, with respect to the social needs of the people, whether it's literacy or healthcare and so on and so forth. So it's not easy. Because we have a hostile media here. We not only face a hostile government, essentially a right-wing neoliberal government, but of course we also have the mainstream corporate press to contend with. So it's an uphill struggle, but we're finding that when we can reach people, when we can speak to workers in their unions and in their workplaces, when we can engage with students and with people who are marginalized, certainly with the indigenous peoples, we're starting to make some headway. About 2 months ago, we had a special webinar to mark Indigenous Day in Canada, and the main speaker was Evo Morales, who gave a fantastic speech, and we had 5 or 6 Indigenous leaders from Canada who shared the platform with Evo Morales. And it was very eye-opening for them. Many of them, believe it or not, didn't really know that much about what was going on in Bolivia, despite the fact that Bolivia, of course, has got the largest proportion of its population anywhere in the Americas who are indigenous. More than 2/3 of the population of Bolivia are indigenous peoples. So this was quite eye-opening, and it's starting to open some doors with respect to Native organizations, indigenous organizations in this country. So it's an uphill battle, but we're making progress.
I mean, you mentioned Canadian mining companies and their role in last year's coup, which came soon after the first industrial lithium mines were inaugurated by Evo Morales himself. Who has benefited the most since the coup, and what can they expect to lose if the mass were to regain power?
Well, it's interesting that shortly after the coup, not only the responses of government, but the responses on well, Bay Street. It's our version of Wall Street. It's the big stock market and capital markets in Canada, based in Toronto. Um, the response was that this was a very positive thing, and that their outlook for Bolivia is that it's a high risk, but also a high reward location for investment. Now that Evo Morales is out of government and there's the Anez interim government was put in place and so on. So what they're saying is that, in fact, Canadian mining investment in Bolivia is relatively small compared to a number of other countries. And that's why they're anxious to get in there. That's why they supported this coup. Whether they had a direct hand in financing it is another matter. We don't have evidence of that. But certainly they were overjoyed by the putsch, or the coup d'état, which took place last November, and by extension, they would be amongst the big losers if the mass is reelected, and if the Bolivian people take back their democracy, and ensure that any investment that does take place on their lands and in their territories is not one that is just for the benefit of foreign capital, but serves the interests and the economy and the needs of the Bolivian people. So they would lose big time, and I think that is an indication of why the Canadian government and Chrystia Freeland in the first place has been taking such a hostile attitude towards the progressive forces in Latin America, why they participate in the Lima group, why Chrystia Freeland, immediately after the coup d'etat, recognized the Anez government and said that it was a victory for the Bolivian people. This is why they take the position that they do. There's big money, there's big interest involved here.
Now, it's interesting that you brought up how the coup was painted in Canada as basically an opportunity for investors. Is this a recurring theme with how such events are refocused for a global North audience by corporate media? And how do Canadians in general react to these events?
Well, that's an interesting question. I mean, when the Financial Post and when these various business think tanks talk to themselves and talk to each other, they talk in terms of investment opportunities and how to increase their profits. But that's not how they talk to the Canadian people. When it comes to the broad masses of the people, they know that it's pretty transparent. If they say that it's good for business, people say, well, yeah, but how is it good for the rest of us? So they couch it in other terms. They couch it in terms of humanitarian interventionism. So, for instance, Canada went to war and occupied and was part of the occupying forces in Afghanistan, for instance, for almost 15 years. And that was couched in terms of our responsibility to protect the Afghan women and to bring about the equality of Afghan women. In the case of Syria, it's our responsibility to oppose a dictator who gasses their own people, and so on. And so we have to protect them. Whether it's in China, in Xinjiang, we have to protect the Muslim population. They didn't care about that when they were bombing Libya and the Muslims in Libya, but all of a sudden, when it comes to China, they're great defenders of the Muslims. So they couch it in terms of upholding democracy, upholding human rights, upholding their responsibility to protect for humanitarian reasons. But this is a pretext. This is a cover, and it's a pretty effective cover. It confuses a lot of people, and that's the big challenge that we have, is to expose that and get at the real reasons why the foreign policy that the Canadian government is pursuing is what it is.
And how does media really report on these issues of human rights violations in these countries? What are your thoughts on that?
Well, I mean, first of all, it's very selective. It's interesting that they would make a very big deal about the repression of protests, peaceful protests, in a place like Hong Kong, for instance, where after months and months of protests, I think one or two people died. But when hundreds of people are dying in Haiti, or in places like Bolivia, the press is completely silent about it. And so it's not as if they're miscovering it; they don't cover it. There's a wall of silence, and the only way that Canadians can find out what's going on in a number of these countries, um, Saudi Arabia, for instance, and the crimes that have been committed against Yemen. Um, there's very little coverage in the mainstream media about this, and so that's in fact what, in a small way, given our limited resources, that's what we're trying to do, is to break through that silence and to expose the hypocrisy, utter hypocrisy of the government's approach and their so-called humanitarianism.
Speaking of hypocrisy, not only is it hypocritical that they would do certain or take certain actions and then condemn another country for doing the same, but also the silence that occurs when incidents take place in their own countries. For example, Black Lives Matter's protests in the United States. There has been virtual silence by other nations, other Western countries, but as it relates to that incident, police repression, not only that, but brutality against people protesting and calling for their rights to be respected. So what are your thoughts on that, especially because neighboring Canada, where you are located right now, has said nothing about that issue?
Well, I mean, the government has expressed concern, and that you see, the Canadian government is a bit more sophisticated than the Trump administration. Okay, so they try to give a veneer of being progressive, engaged, sensitive to minorities. They come out and sponsor, anti-racism programs in the schools and so on, which, by the way, is not a bad thing. It's a good thing. But the fact remains that in Canada, for instance, there has been a legacy of not just decades, but centuries of genocidal policies towards the indigenous peoples of Turtle Island, of this territory. Residential schools, the theft of their lands, of their resources, and so on, to the point that even today, in a very advanced country, industrialized country like Canada, very rich in natural resources and so on, and by the way, also the greatest reservoir of fresh water in the world. Nevertheless, you have hundreds upon hundreds of Aboriginal communities in this country that cannot and do not have fresh drinking water. They have to boil their water. And that's because of this systematic racism which exists. Just this week, there was yet another incident that blew up in Nova Scotia, in the east part of Canada, where native fishermen, um, uh, on the basis of a Supreme Court ruling, were trying to harvest some lobster to help to supplement their incomes, particularly hard hit because of the pandemic and so on. And commercial fishermen on the phony basis that they're concerned about conserving this resource, went and attacked these native fishermen, destroyed their boats, destroyed their gear, burnt down their buildings, uh, and fortunately nobody was killed, but they were almost prepared to burn some of the indigenous people alive as part of this. And the RCMP, the federal police in Canada, were there in their cars, in their squad cars, and did absolutely nothing to protect these Aboriginal peoples that had come under this. It's quite clearly a racist and a vicious white supremacist attack. Um, so you know, these are the contradictions. Whether it's in respect to labor rights or the environment, Canada also says it's very concerned about climate change, and yet Canada is a main proponent of building more pipelines and extracting the tar sands in Alberta, one of the dirtiest forms of oil in the world, that adds tremendously to CO2 emissions and the resulting climate change. And so the government talks out of both sides of their mouth, and they're very skilled at it. They've been doing it for decades, for centuries, and the media. And I'm speaking primarily of the mainstream corporate media, not the independent media or social media and so on. But the mainstream media have completely abandoned even a pretense of investigative journalism. They
Yeah.
add they act now as essentially a PR department for government policy.
I mean,
It's disgusting.
Miguel, a lot of countries that try to continue to do business with nations like, for example, Venezuela or Iran, they face the threat of sanctions by the United States, and the United States acting with autonomy as though its laws and its foreign policy is international law. But a country like Canada, and that's just for example, doesn't necessarily face the same risk as other nations who intend to continue to do trade and barter with these nations. So why do you think that Canada continues to take the position that it does?
Well, because Canada is one of the it's a firm member of the imperialist group of powers in the world. It's part of NATO. It plays a very active role in military procurement. Right now, there's a big battle going on. As a matter of fact, just before joining you, I was in a teleconference with peace activists across the country over the plans of the Canadian government to purchase 88 new F-35 fighter jets. These are stealth fighter jets, which will be nuclear capable. In other words, capable of firing nuclear weapons and nuclear rockets. Um, and these weapons are not for the defense of the Canadian frontier or the Canadian boundaries, to protect our north and so on and so forth. These are weapons which are completely compatible with fighting wars abroad, and Canada has participated in that. When we went and as part of NATO, bombed Belgrade in 1999, went into Afghanistan, bombed Libya. As a matter of fact, it was a Canadian general that was in charge of the air operations of the NATO powers in Libya to overthrow President Gaddafi. So yeah, yes, Canada could play an important role. It could um, undercut a lot of the sanctions that the U.S. government is imposing. It has uh, ideally or potentially it has the capacity to do that, um, but it has thrown in its lot with the United States. The one exception is Cuba, because Canada has a continuing relationship with Cuba. It does not participate in the U.S. blockade directly. However, the Canadian government as well has been becoming increasingly critical of Cuba. It's joining in the chorus about Cuba. And there are many Canadian businesses that are being impacted by the U.S. Blockade of Cuba, which is a violation of Canadian law. It has to do with extraterritoriality. And in fact, was a law passed over 15 years ago, which explicitly um, um, prevents, or should prevent at least, the U.S. application of its blockade on Canadian companies. But the fact of the matter is that the Canadian government hasn't been enforcing that law. And so, in many respects, Canada is complicit with the blockade of Cuba. It's less obvious, but it's there as well. But certainly, with respect to other countries, Iran, uh, Syria, with respect to the Palestinian people, certainly with respect to Venezuela, sanctions have now been imposed. Canadian sanctions have been imposed against Nicaragua. There's many examples. The list is not as long as the U.S. I think the U.S. has sanctions against some 39 countries, but Canada has sanctions against 19 of those countries, including the Russian Federation, including um, against China, and so on. So, yeah, I mean, you could say that Canada is not as bad as our southern neighbor, but it has essentially thrown in its lot with Fortress America. And this is something which, when we talk to ordinary Canadians, people disagree with that. They say, why are we doing with what Donald Trump is doing, or with what the U.S. Congress is doing? Um, they don't want to see Canada playing that kind of role, um, but they feel disempowered. They feel that regardless of what governments say before election time or during election campaigns, that they just aren't going to listen to the Canadian people, and so that's part of the frustration. And of course, ordinary working people are confronted with real problems right here: unemployment, a lack of social services, concerns about the Canadian environment, and what have you. So foreign policy tends to get less attention than issues at home.
Turning for a bit to the topic of imperialism and how it affects indigenous lives, how do you think Latin American nations can break the bonds of dependence with organizations such as the OAS, which was instrumental in last year's coup in Bolivia?
Well, in fact, if we go back over the past 20 odd years, or back to 1999, with the election of Hugo Chavez in Venezuela, that process began to unfold slowly, but it gained momentum with the formation of ALBA, with several other initiatives that were taken to create the conditions for the peoples of this hemisphere to essentially stand up to the dictates of U.S. imperialism, of Washington. Um, and I think that that's one of the reasons, of course, why we're seeing this pushback. For a decade or more, the United States was so preoccupied with what was going on in Iraq and Afghanistan and elsewhere that um, they, to some extent, put their campaign to turn back the clock, if you will, in the Americas. They put that on hold. But certainly over the past several years, it's quite clear that what's unfolded is a coordinated campaign in country after country in Central America, in even in Mexico itself, certainly in Brazil, in Chile, in Peru, etc., uh, Colombia, uh, directed at weakening the progressive forces, people's forces in Latin America, and undermining the material base for that movement, which was Venezuela, the other countries of ALBA, both in the Caribbean and in Latin America. And they have been disturbingly successful. The most recent, of course, being Bolivia itself, and the tremendous pressure that's being brought to bear on Venezuela and increasingly on Cuba. So the tides have turned, but what goes around comes around, and we remain confident that 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 this can be reversed. But what it'll require will be not just change of government, but a real popular revolutions which take control of the resources, the state, the apparatus of the state, which means the armies, the courts, and so on and so forth, to ensure that they are put at the disposal of the people and not the elites, not the oligarchies.